Morning everybody, welcome to Penn Vicarage on this Thursday morning. I hope you're having a good week and thank you for joining us for our Bible reflection for today, continuing through the book of the prophet Isaiah. Today we're going to do two chapters, chapter 19 and 20. 20 is very short anyway. So without further ado, Isaiah 19 and 20, all about Egypt. An oracle concerning Egypt. See, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt. The idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them. I will stir with Egyptians against Egyptians. They will fight one against the other, neighbor against neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. The spirit of the Egyptians within them will be emptied out, and I will confound their plans. They will consult the idols and spirits of the dead, and the ghosts and the familiar spirits. I will deliver the Egyptians into the hand of a hard master. A fierce king will rule over them, says the sovereign, the Lord of hosts. The waters of the Nile will be dried up, and the river will be parched and dry. Its canals will become foul, and the branches of Egypt's Nile will diminish and dry up. Reeds and rushes will rot away. There'll be bare places by the Nile, on the brink of the Nile, and all that's sown up by the Nile will dry up and driven away and be no more. Those who fish will mourn. Those who cast hooks in the Nile will lament, and those who spread nets on the water will languish. The workers in flax will be in despair, and the carders and those at the loom will grow pale. Its weavers will be dismayed, and all who work for wages will be grieved. The princes of Zoan are utterly foolish. The wise counselors of Pharaoh give stupid counsel. How can you say to Pharaoh, I am one of the sages, a descendant of ancient kings? Where now are your sages? Let them tell you and make known what the Lord of hosts has planned against Egypt. The princes of Zoan have become fools, and the princes of Memphis are deluded. Those who are the cornerstones of its tribes have led Egypt astray. The Lord has poured into them a spirit of confusion. They've made Egypt stagger in all its doings, as a drunkard staggers around in vomit. Neither head nor tail, palm branch or reed will be able to do anything for Egypt. On that day, the Egyptians will be like women and tremble with fear because before the hand that the Lord of hosts raises against them. And the hand of Judah will become a terror to the Egyptians. Everyone to whom it's mentioned will fear because of the plan that the Lord of hosts is planning against them. On that day, there'll be 5 cities in the land of Egypt that speak the language of Canaan and swear allegiance to the Lord of hosts. One of these will be called the City of the Sun. On that day, there'll be an altar to the Lord in the center of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord at its border. It will be a sign and witness to the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. When they cry to the Lord, because of oppressors, he will send them a saviour, and will defend and deliver them. The Lord will make himself known to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians will know the Lord on that day, and will worship with sacrifice and burnt offerings, and will make vows to the Lord and perform them. The Lord will strike Egypt, striking and healing. They will return to the Lord, and he will hear their supplication and listen, and heal them. On that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian will come to Egypt, and the Egyptian will come into Assyria, and the Egyptians will worship with the Assyrians. On that day, Israel will be the third with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my heritage. In the year that the commander-in-chief, who was sent by King Sargon of Assyria, came to Ashdod and fought against it and took it, at that time the Lord had spoken to Isaiah, son of Amos, saying, Go, loose the sackcloth from your loins, and take the sandals from your feet. And he had done so, walking naked and barefoot. And the Lord said, Just as my servant Isaiah has walked naked and barefoot for 3 years as a sign and portent against Egypt and Assyria, so shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptians as captives and the Ethiopians as exiles, both the young and the old, naked and barefoot, with buttocks uncovered, to the shame of Egypt. And they shall be dismayed and confounded because of Ethiopia, their hope, and of Egypt, their boast. In that day, the inhabitants of the coastland will say, See, this is what's happened to those with whom we hoped, and to whom we fled for help and deliverance from the king of Assyria. And we, how shall we escape? And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, Essentially, there are three sections in this. The first section is kind of judgment, difficult days yet to come, or the problems of Egypt. The second third, which is 16 to the end of chapter 19, are all about, in a sense, the Lord's intervention. And chapter 20 are an interesting story about a bit of prophecy Isaiah does as well, in a rather interesting way. Chapter 9, firstly, in the first three sections of chapter 19, you hear the problems that Egypt's got. Now, Egypt had a heyday about 1000 BC under the pharaohs and so on, but for several hundred years that their heyday had gone, and they've been waxing and waning rather. And what Isaiah essentially is saying here is that the Egyptians have got three major problems, which the Lord identifies here. Firstly, it's that their religion is very poor. Instead of turning to God, they turn to ghosts and spirits of the dead. Isn't that a thing today? Isn't that thing people do today? People turn to ghosts and spirits of the dead, all that spiritualism and all that sort of stuff as well, and so on and so on. So basically, that they're turning in the wrong direction, and as a result, they're turning on each other. So rather than turning to God, their rock, on who we can trust and depend, in the sense he says, the Egyptians instead are turning to ghosts and spirits of the dead. Dare I say the sort of things that lots of people turn to today. It's horoscopes, all this type of stuff. We should be turning to God. That's the first problem they've got. The second problem they've got in verses 5 to 10 is an over-dependence on one source of income, you might say, which is the River Nile. 95% of people in Egypt at the time live very, very close to the River Nile, which is obviously it's the second biggest river in the world or something. And obviously it's a very important source of, of fish and agriculture and so on and so on and so on. What's saying in sense here, because they're so dependent on the Nile, environmental problems happen and the Nile dries up. Where are you left with then? And again, it's important to remember that, we shouldn't be overly dependent on one thing, except on God, of course. And then next in verses 11 to 15, you have the other problem Egypt got, which is basically got terrible leadership. They're not, the princes of Zoan have become fools. The princes of Memphis, which by the way is a place in Egypt rather than a place where Elvis Presley came from. Those who are cornerstones of truth have led Egypt astray. So basically saying bad leadership. So essentially, Egypt's got three problems. They've got bad religion. Instead of looking to God, they're looking to spirits of the dead and that sort of stuff. Secondly, the over-dependence on the one river. And thirdly, the third problem they've got is that their leadership is very, very poor. Very quality leadership. Then in verses 16 to the end of the chapter, he looks forward to a day when God is going to intervene. And 5 times he says, in that day. And verse 16 to 17, that the bad times come to Egypt, and he says they're going to turn to God. Because they were so frightened, they turned to God. Then verse 18, you got all of a sudden, instead of being having allegiance to other gods, in a sense, verse 18 says that day will come when they'll have allegiance to God. Then in verse 19, God says God will send a saviour. Of course, we have Jesus, who is a saviour for all the world, not just for the people of Israel. Then in verses 23 and verse 23, you have Egypt and Assyria actually beginning to work together and worshipping together. And then verse 24, they join in with Israel. So get Egypt, Assyria and Israel together worshipping God. That God is not just the God of the Jews, but God is the God of everybody. And here he looks forward to a day when God will be God of all things. That people who have looked elsewhere will turn to God instead. That God, as I say, not just God of a few, God is God of the world. And because God intervenes, God is a God of the world. And because they worship together, they become a blessing to everybody around them. Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my heritage. So because God has intervened, notice he's not an act of, not of act of humanity. This is an act of God. And he says, a blessing in the midst of the earth. And that's what our faith is meant to be. And he looks forward to a day when Egypt, Assyria, and Israel will worship together, and together worshipping the one true God. Then in chapter 20, have an interesting bit of prophecy here, because Isaiah says consistently through that the people of God should not form, should be allied to God and not form allegiance to the people that can't help them. And there's clearly a danger that they're going to join with Egypt, which at this time is looking elsewhere and is not going to help them. And instead of looking to God, and God needs to be at the centre of all things, they look to Egypt instead. And what kind of demonstrated this is that Isaiah walked around naked, showing his buttocks for 3 years to demonstrate, rather graphically, you might say, the fact that one day Egypt's going to be taken away. And so don't join with these people, because unless you want to be taken away like this yourself. And this walking around for 3 years with somewhat undressed would have been an interesting object lesson to demonstrate, turn to God. God's our rock, God's our saviour. God can clothe us with righteousness rather than looking to other things that can't help you. And Isaiah, in this rather graphic way, demonstrates what God is saying, which is ally with God and not with other people that can't help you. So in these 2 chapters, which are essentially about Egypt, firstly, you've got Egypt's problem, which is bad religion, looking to the wrong places rather than God, that you've got over-dependence on the River Nile, and also the fact that they're foolish leadership. This is no good. Then he looks forward to a day when God's going to intervene, that God will send a saviour, that the fear will drive people to God, that people from across the world will have that, an allegiance to God as well. God will bless them. They will worship together, and they'll be a blessing to the world. Then in chapter 20, in the meantime, whilst Egypt isn't turning to God, God's people should instead be absolutely sold out for God. They should look to God and to God alone. And today, my friends, we should look to Christ and to Christ alone. Others can't help us, as they couldn't help them here. And Isaiah uses this rather interesting way of demonstrating this. And so we should turn to people that can help us, that can clothe us, who can help us be a blessing. And our allegiance should be 100% with God and God alone. Friends, I hope that's helpful. God bless you. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Have a lovely day.